podcast. My name is Josh Lindquist. My co-host Will Shaw is having some tech issues, but he'll be joining us shortly. And today we have our friend Michael Camarillo. You are actually our first returning guest on the podcast because we've been getting so many new guests. We haven't had anyone who's been on come back on a second time. So you are the first one, my friend. That's very exciting.
Well, this would be my third, right? I was on your Halloween episode.
Right, yeah. So third, actually. So you're just setting records all over the place, man. That's awesome. Well, when we had you on, it was very early in our podcast. We talked about your first book, Keeper 829, and now we're going to talk about Warder 516, which was going to come out next week, but it got released early, right?
Yes, it did.
That's awesome.
I love the self-publishing life.
Yes, that's awesome, man. That's really exciting. So our listeners can find your books on Amazon and then your website, michaelcamarillo.books.com, which the link will be down in the podcast description. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about the books and let's get our listeners excited.
Yeah, awesome. So, yeah, I think you can reference. I'm not going to talk too much about Keeper 829, but they kind of go hand in hand. But you can check out the other episode that Josh
there'll be a link in this corner.
Awesome.
This corner? Yeah, for Keeper 829.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the top corner, yeah.
But yeah, so the entire series is called the Keeper Program. So it's like a computer program. It's the Keeper Program. It's all about AI. There's a lot of AI in this, a lot of sci-fi components laced in throughout. I really kind of go cross-genre throughout my book. So Keeper 829, it kind of morphed into a sci-fi-esque book. But it was really primarily or predominantly dystopian. I was creating this dystopian world. It morphed a little bit into sci-fi. They kind of go hand in hand, but the other component is that I have a bunch of historical fiction aspects in it as well, because there's a bunch of flashbacks where my character is kind of piecing together this kind of quasi amnesia that she has as a sentient AI. And she's learning her place in this new world and this experience through flashbacks. So I'm a history buff, and that was my little call out to Anne Rice, who's my favorite author. I wanted to write history, so there's all these different components in there. Warder 516 kind of went a little further into the sci-fi realm, kind of diverged a bit away from the dystopian. There are still some of the flashbacks that you get. They're much less frequent. In Keeper 829, you'll find them almost every chapter. In Warder 516, they're only critical moments where they, really help to paint that picture. Yeah. But the characters really start developing a lot more. Warder 516 it's based off planet. So we do go out to a futuristic terraformed Mars that's also dystopian in nature. Because we are coming into it as my main character, Nesha, Keeper 829, is coming into this world as brand new, eyes wide open, didn't know this existed. It's been kept secret for, a very long time. So she's having that novelty experience as we go in and trying to learn this place. But it is at a stage of its existence where it has been around for a while. The civilization there has been on there for a while. They've been oppressed. They're being downtrodden and broken down in the institution, which is an oppressive organization, and Keeper 829 has reached all the way out to Mars and beyond, which you'll find out in Warder 516. Wow. But yeah, so it's not called Mars, it's called Homestead 1. So if I mention Homestead 1, you'll find out that is Mars itself. And you'll see that transition if you read Keeper 829 to Warder 516. They call it Mars Base in Keeper 829 because of this secretive nature. No one understood what it actually was, and you don't realize it's called Homestead 1, and there's much more to it until you read Warder 516.
That's cool. I like that. And I love that cover for Warder 516 with the moon looming in the background so large. Like that just screams like sci-fi mystery to me, and I'm like, oh, I love that,
Yeah, I really enjoyed making the covers. I had fun with that.
That's all. And you made them yourself?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Wow, that's really good, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, I dabble in a number of different things. I call myself a multi-potentialite. So I try. I know the big rule of thumb online. You look at all the forums. They're like, do not make your own cover art. But
no, you're awesome, man.
I ran it by quite a few people who are graphic designers, and they were like, hey, they liked it. So I was like, okay, cool. Then I'm gonna stick to my guns.
Dude, those are great covers, man. That's awesome. I really like it.
Thank you.
That's
I
really
appreciate
cool.
it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, man. No, I mean, I like to talk about how many things you do because that's really cool. I mean, you run a travel agency, you're an author, you're a cover designer, you have a great, YouTube channel where you ask interviews, which I've been honored to be on. Um, just the questions you ask and how philosophical and deep you get are really cool. So, what are some other cool things you're into that people might not know about? Some other cool interests or areas of expertise?
I play baseball religiously.
No, I
Uh,
didn't know that.
I've
That's
been,
awesome.
yeah, I've been playing baseball my whole life, and my wife actually set me aside yesterday and was like, "Hey, is everything okay?" And I'm like, What are you talking about?" She was like, "You were playing baseball a lot more than normal. You're playing on like 5 teams. You're like
Oh
gone
wow.
on every day. Like you're playing." And she's like, "You were getting older. You're really sore all the time." And I'm like, "Yeah, but I love the game."
Yeah.
And come to find out, when I talked to her, I was kind of like in this little moment right now in my life where like I have so many things going on
Yeah.
that I feel somewhat overwhelmed, and I'm having trouble like grasping on to like what I need to do. It's so
Yeah.
fleeting all the time. And I told her, I was like, I'm always tired. Everything's fleeting. And, it's like baseball is my thing. That's my Zen moment. And she was like, that's awesome. But you realize playing every night is going to make you even more tired, right? I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's probably true. So, but
That's
yeah,
how I
that's one
am
thing.
with Dungeons and Dragons, man. I take on too many games and I'm like I'm pretty much playing every day, but I'm like it's fun and it helps my creativity. So it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
totally get that, man. It's that weird balance we're trying to find where we want to be, hey Will, how's it going?
Hey,
Will, this is Michael. Michael, this is Will.
Hey, well, nice seeing you.
I'm
nice to talk to you again,
Yeah.
Michael.
I'm glad the tech gods finally allowed you to join us, Will.
Yes, thankfully, I'm dealing with an Apple update over here, and
Oh,
it's been,
fun.
eh, well, we're past the hardship at least.
That's good. That's good. Well, we're talking about Michael's new book, Warrior 516, which just came out, so very exciting. And unlike the first book, this one takes place primarily off-world, which is very exciting, very fun sci-fi layers. So we were diving into all of that, and it was really cool.
Yeah, I remember when we were the Keeper 829 back. What was that? A few weeks ago, a couple months. It's hard to say. Time has no
I think
meaning.
it was like a year, actually.
Hey, that's concept in my book. Is time really real?
Yeah.
Nice.
Meaningless.
It's yeah. Time used to have meaning back in the before times, but anymore it's just like four walls in my little hovel here. So yeah, but I remember we were talking about you wanting to you were excited for this new book where it was going to be following a different kind of a different storyline, not the plot from the prior novel, right?
Yeah, so it is part of the series. It does continue on with the journey. But I'm experimenting in terms of the way I write. I talked to Josh a little bit about that. I'm writing kind of cross genre. Instead of the dystopian elements being really heavy, it's much more heavy in the sci-fi component now. Another big change I did do with the book. So at the maybe not the advice of my editor, but I was like, hey, I'm a self-published author. I'm going to do me. I'm going to brand myself this way. Instead of writing past tense third person, I wrote first person present tense. And
Oh,
I took those chapters from being longer, typically around 3,000, 5,000 words in Keeper 829, to about 1,700 to 2,200 words in Warrior 516. So
oh,
it is much faster, much more like you can feel how action packed and quick pace it is.
that's cool. And does that kind of reflect where the characters are at in terms of the two books? Like in the first one, is it a little more of the character realizing what the world is about and finding themselves through flashbacks? So it's kind of a slower pace and more introspective. And then the second book is more the world's more established, so there's a lot more action and plot happening. Is that kind of the
Exactly. Yeah, it
oh,
really
cool.
does follow the characters. My main character, Keeper 829, Nesha, she really is coming into her own in this book. I know one of the criticisms in my early editing phases of Keeper 829 was that my heroine was too passive.
Uh,
And I was like, that was my intent. I wanted her to be that way. She needed to find herself. She was going through some major existential problems in that book. And ultimately, toward the end, she started kind of maturing and coming to age a little bit. But that character arc was really kind of like, it was going up, and then it kind of just hit about the climax, and you don't, at the end, you don't really know where she's going. Typically in a book, you would have that whole character arc, right, all the way through the end. But I left it kind of open ended because I knew I was going to write a 4-book series. And in book 2, you really see her start developing, and straight out of the box, she's coming out like she's a lot tougher, a lot stronger, a lot more assertive. And yeah, you really, I think that's why when I was having this conversation with my editor, we were debating whether I should go back to third person or not, because it was quite, it was pretty difficult for me to actually adjust that writing style and figure out how to get enough detail into it in that first person present tense. And when I, talked to her about it, I was like, I want this sense of urgency and, this agency that she has. And I feel like the only way I can really reflect that is through that first person, keeping that momentum moving consistently. So I think it worked out with the characters, and they kind of dictated where it went and where book 3 is going to go. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. So that's also kind of an interesting shift, and I gotta imagine as far as like the writing process has gotta change up if you're going from a third person to a first person type of view. Is there something else that you're trying to do with the with that shift in perspective, or is it just like your feeling on how you wanted to write the book?
So I think it was a bit of both. Really, what I'm trying to dig into, and you'll see, I don't want to give away the spoilers, but with Water in this book, there's a lot of kind of dialogue about personality. So really, you'll see a lot of. I've had experience with personality disorders, people in my life, and things of that nature, and I really wanted to dig into that concept. And my character is dealing with some of these personality traits, where she's having multiple personalities come into her. And again, I do not want to give that away. If I go into too much depth, we'll give it away. But I think it was really vital to really express what she was feeling every moment to moment, to actually convey that to the reader.
Yeah. Well, and her also being an artificial intelligence, I figure that gives you some room to showcase what someone who's actually experiencing that could be feeling in the moment, but then also exploring what someone with a manufactured system of cognition, how it could differ. So that's a really exciting thing to explore.
Huh.
Yeah. There's constant battle of I'm this intelligent being that should do this, that should versus what, so
wow.
Yeah, it does kind of, when you put it like that, it does kind of give kind of an interesting take on what is the self if you're dealing with an artificial intelligence. Moving that to a first person perspective, I imagine that would give you a little more room to explore that from like a who am I type of question that you wouldn't necessarily be able to tackle from a third party perspective, or an omniscient view. Oh man.
I'm not editing that out. That's staying in the. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh no. At least like bleep it out. Like put the distortion over my mouth so people think I'm just cursing.
Just cursing randomly. Yes. Yeah. So,
yeah, I'm not going to give it away, but in book 3, I'm probably going to keep it first person, because it's going to get even more complex in terms of that dynamic. There's going to be a descent to insanity. I'm not going to say which character, but there's going to be it's going to be a complicated book to write. I'm debating when I really want to dig into it. So it's going to be
that's got to be kind of a heavy subject, because even from a non-sci-fi, like just everyday person, just when you start talking like that type of philosophy, those are some pretty heavy topics, even when you're not using like a framing device of fantasy or sci-fi to try to metaphorize that type of conversation. So I can only imagine like doing that through a fantasy novel without trying to go way overboard has got to be kind of a challenge. Just staying on the edge of that knife of heavy-handedness versus not quite conveying what, getting to the point where you're wanting to. That was a terrible explanation on that.
I totally get you though. What you're putting down, yeah. I do know, like, I think Josh, you mentioned, book one is is very deep. And for those of you who've read it, you would understand, it is very philosophical. There's a lot of metaphysical, discourse and dialogue in it, and a lot of big questions are raised. I talk about a lot of contentious issues. I think I did this. I did a reel on Instagram before I was releasing Keeper 829. I said, this book is not for you if, and basically I listed everyone that, if you're a devout believer, if you're a devout atheist, if you were either way, either pole, if you're on either end of the spectrum, the book is not for you. But if you're a conspiracy theorist, you might like it. So it was a fun video. Basically, that's awesome. I was reminding people, like, hey, this book, is fiction. I talk about a lot of things that are very close to home and very real in our current world and where we stand. And I did that intentionally, but I want people to understand, that it is fiction. We need to have these conversations, but I'm not trying to ruffle feathers. I'm just trying to raise awareness. But book one. So my daughter, I have 2 kids, and we actually raise our kids with a very open kind of lifestyle, and we share a lot with her. A lot more than some parents would say, are necessary for a 9-year-old. But we think open communication is the way to go. I say that to frame that I haven't let her read book one. I don't think she's very, very advanced, very, very mature for her age, but I have not let her read it. But I gave her book 2 right off the bat, and she's already like halfway through it and loves it.
Oh wow!
So that gives you a little understanding of the difference in the writing of the 2 stories.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Interesting. So if someone's listening to this podcast and they haven't read either of your books, the best way to go is for them to get Keeper 829 and then go to Warder 516, though, right? So they can see the full arc going.
I would think so. I mean, either one. I think I wrote it in a way that you could read it as a standalone. But if you want to get the full, experience, I would go 1 to 2. I would go. So
that's awesome. Oh, sorry. Weird morning. I've been grappling with insomnia lately. It's been delightful. So
that's always fun.
My sleep schedule's just fractured. It's terrible. But
I'll talk to you if I want one of my characters to deal with that.
Yeah. No, that's cool. That's cool.
Yeah. The nice thing about insomnia is since you're not sleeping, you're way more productive, right?
Ideally. Well, good question though.
Dealt with insomnia. Disclaimer: you are not more productive when you do not sleep.
It's true. But Michael, with the second book having so much more of a sci-fi element to it, did you have to do a lot of research for some of the stuff in your book, or was it all stuff that you already knew about? Or I'm just curious, what the role of research played in your book.
I did do a lot more research in this one in terms of the minor components I did. So my book one, I did a lot of research into ideologies, governmental structures, and history.
That's awesome.
But 2, I did a lot more research in, that technology. I read a bunch into genetic engineering because that's a component that's laced throughout, but I really start kind of digging into it more in book 2.
Okay.
And then I was fortunate that my editor, Becky Robinson, she had a friend who actually, I don't remember what he does, but he's like an expert in Mars. So he actually kind of QA/QC'd some of the things in my book. I was like, hey, here's some suggestions depending on what level of terraforming you are. If you want descent, if you want these different things. So I was fortunate for that. But I did mention there that I want to put a disclaimer out that some of it may not make sense. And I had to argue with that for him because I was like, yes, we're at a far terraformed, level, yet it's dystopian. Yet we have surpassed. So there are some components of degradation that show through, that you might expect in a less terraformed. So Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, if a corrupt dystopian bureaucratic organization was in charge of the terraforming, it would be inherently imperfect, and they would let certain elements slip through the cracks. So that
Yeah.
adds a level of realism in my mind that is really appealing. You know, that's cool.
Yeah, and I think kind of no matter how far into the future or how far advanced, really, it's kind of a trope among just humanity that we're always in the post apocalypse. There was always a golden age back before, and
That's so
so
yeah.
like yeah, I think like you lack relatability if you lack any type of like degradation or
Wear and tear on the
decline.
world, kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it just doesn't feel real if it's not there.
Yeah. Everything was always better before.
Yeah.
I read somewhere that that was one of the reasons that some initial backers backed George Lucas's the first Star Wars movie back in the 70s, was that a lot of the sci-fi up until that point had been very like Buck Rogers chrome, you know, very like very
Mhm.
clean production design of this like utopian future. And then George Lucas was like, we're going to have a desert planet and dirty cantinas with a bunch of aliens sitting around and drinking, and everything's going to look worn down. And a lot of people were like, oh, like we haven't really seen this much. That's a really cool element. So I think you guys are
Yeah.
both right about that adds so much realism to the
Mhm.
world when it looks very lived in by the people who are there. So that's really cool.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of the important thing is always to remember like we're humans, we ruin everything. And like to not have like a little bit of destruction around it, it's like you need to see that to be able to be like, yeah, this is human, this is humanity.
Well, to pivot off that, Michael, I've got a question for you. So,
Yeah.
if this is a spoiler, don't answer. But if you can answer without spoiling, I'd love to hear. What are kind of the AIs in your story? What's their relationship or their view on humanity? Like, do they take a um, like, are they trying to be more like humanity, or do they think that they're beyond humanity? Do they think humans are inherently flawed, or that humans are kind of the pinnacle of evolution? Like, what's kind of the AI consensus on the nature of humanity in your books?
So that is a very complicated concept.
Yeah,
And,
Mhm.
and there's many layers in both books that kind of dig into that. So you need to think about it in terms of a pyramid. You got your keepers and then warders. We haven't even gotten into what a warder is, but you'll find that out in the books. But
okay.
the keepers and the warders are ultimately your like pinnacle AI, the extraterrestrials that have been on Earth, interdicting with our humanity and our existence. So they it also depends on like which character, because some of them like Nesha is a keeper, but she is very human. She and that comes into her experience. Her lived experiences change the way she perceives humans. She has this like voice in the back of her head telling her, that I have these directives. I am of this greater civilization. I am in charge of keeping you safe. You are my children. Yet she feels human. She's wondering, why am I feeling these emotions of humans? And she
Oh,
empathizes and all that. Then you got the villain. You got Keeper 704, who is holier than thou and feels, I am the gift. I am the universe's gift to you. I am
Mhm.
beyond all of you AI and everything. Whether you're AI or organic, I am the best. So you got different layers there, and then once you move down from the keepers and warders, you've got other artificially intelligent beings that are in this world that fill out the world, and you got what are called IDAs. They're IDA units, and that was based on the I think I talked about it as a integrated what was it, intelligent distribution agent. It was I think we talked about it on our last the last episode I came on. It was like a technology that was used by the
Mhm.
Navy and HR back in the like 50s, and slowly it's been the framework to develop cognition in artificial beings now in computers and stuff. But yeah, so the IDA units are like your lowest level AI that are introduced in Keeper 829, and I liken them in that book to a Mr. Clippy, if you remember that reference.
Yeah.
So they are very like they're humanoid, they look human, but they're servants. They serve you. They do all the low level tasks. They're your garbage men, they're your painters, they're your everyone who does they do the jobs that the humans didn't want to anymore. So that's that level. Then you've got the LIDAs, the learning independent or intelligent distribution agent. Those are your next level up. And those are your more warriors, more security guards, and they create the armies that these keepers are building. I haven't really gotten too much into how they perceive humans, but based on just interaction, I think they have a very stormtrooper-esque feel, that they're very rigid, following a set of structured parameters that, you do this, you do that. And
that totally fits when they're created for a certain role, that their outlook's going to be very limited to fulfilling that role, whereas your keepers and your warders are more like big picture kind of people. So that's really cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, hope that answers.
That does. No, that's fascinating. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because we were having a conversation a few weeks back with another friend of the show about artificial intelligence in the creation of art and potentially in writing scripts for films. And it was my position that you're going to see a lot of AI on the lower ends replacing just like entry level positions, but in the same way that it happened with like construction, where we have a lot of machines handling the base end of constructions, like creating drywall instead of having plasterers set up walls for buildings, or having essentially pre-made brick walls instead of getting people out there to lay bricks. You're just putting siding on now. And my hypothesis is you're going to see a similar thing in the art community, where these AIs are going to take in entry levels for artists, and then you're going to still need high-end artists. My point being, to come back, is it seems like you're kind of explanation there. It seems like you're kind of following that thought process as well, where you have a lot of those low-end functions being handled by AI, and I was just wanting your opinion on like how you see AI kind of evolving here in like the real world.
Yeah, I mean, I think my words speak for themselves in the way I wrote. I mean, that's mm-hmm. my opinion. I agree with you in that aspect, and I think we're already seeing that. Like you mentioned, we're seeing mm-hmm. things being prefabricated, and I think the idea is, when I'm building this dystopian world, I envisioned, that what does a government want when there's all this chaos, right? What does an organization need to pacify a people and bring everyone together and be able to lord it over them? And it's efficiency and optimizing resources. How are you going to do that? You can do that with the technology you have. You're going to place an emphasis on honing that technology to increase that efficiency and optimize those resources. So if you have AI, you have that capacity, why not use that to get that foundation, where you need it, that's constantly churning out what you need, and then you slowly build on top of that. So I think that's where it's going in the real world. I think that's where it needs to go. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense, man. That's cool.
Yeah. And I was always of the opinion that, like, especially with artists, and this goes for not only visual artists like myself, but also for people who write books, painters, musicians, that it, like, a lot of those art forms come down to mistakes that the artists make, and artists knowing when to correct a mistake versus when to just leave one there. And I feel like with AI, you don't really have it, like, it follows rules in a way that humans really don't. And so I think it's really kind of interesting that it seems like with your writing that that's kind of where you're getting to the point where AI is making those mistakes in a way, uh, based on like whether it's emotion or feeling or just whatever. Do
Yeah,
you see that being kind of like or tying into your work?
yeah. I mean, I think if you think about it, I mean, where is AI developed? You know,
Mhm.
it's created by humans, right? So it's going to be inherently flawed. We're gonna whatever programming we put in it, is the programming, you know, perfect? Probably not. Like, who did the programming? You know, how much expertise did they have? Were they suffering from insomnia like Josh? Were they, you know, who knows? Who knows? You know, like there are so many variables that can impact an artificial system
Yeah.
that you can't expect it. And I think that adds to the realism component of writing too, that you can't expect it to be perfect. You
Yeah.
know, that too many people try and believe that there's so much, pop culture that AI is this, rigid, perfect system, and it's not. It can't be. It's inherently impossible,
No.
because we are creating it. And then I dig into that like I have these other beings that are supposedly of higher intelligence and far much further on the evolutionary ramp than us. Yet you know that I tie in this inherent flaw as well, that there's always going to be mistakes made, that there's no such thing as perfection because it's on how we perceive it as well.
Yeah.
And something I just thought about with the art component that you were talking about. So I was an archaeology major in college, and I studied a lot of Roman archaeology, did a lot of study on mosaics, and that was something that
Yeah.
I found really fascinating. In the way Roman artisans made their mosaics, they would have the apprentices work on the perimeters, on the outside parts, and only the most ornate designs on the center were done by the actual artist. So if you look at them, you'll see that there's tons of imperfections on the outside. There's lines that don't match and all these problems, right? And then you see the ornate picture of the gods or whatever it is they're depicting, and it's absolutely beautiful. You step back from it, you see the whole thing, and it's a masterpiece. You don't notice those imperfections unless you get right up on it. So I don't
Wow.
know. That's just something
That,
that piqued interest.
that's fascinating how you can. It seems like a great opportunity to let people work on their craft while building a masterpiece together that all fits together in the big picture. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had I'd never heard that, so that is fascinating.
That's really cool. What was one of the most appealing things about studying archaeology in college? I've always been fascinated by archaeology, so I wanted to pivot into that
Mhm.
real quick before we let you go, because I know you got baseball stuff coming up soon, so we
Yeah.
gotta let you go soon. But
Yeah. So, I think for me, it was studying cultures. So I love learning about different cultures and practices and how they, saw or how they used things around them to basically develop their worldview and their life and their existence.
yeah,
Um, that was always really interesting to me. I think probably what led me to writing with an oppressive organization and stuff like that is I was always fascinated with power dynamics,
yeah,
and I studied my area of focus was Augustan era in Rome, so the first emperor of Rome,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
I was always just fascinated by the fact that he, as a pre emperor of Rome, was a sickly child who was
Mhm.
very underwhelming. He wasn't impressive by any means. He wasn't what you would think of like Julius Caesar, this big, strong warrior, great, but he was sickly his whole life. He wasn't impressive. He was like just kind of lucky that he fell into that role.
huh,
Yet he created the empire. He had such expansive reach in far reaching areas that he never touched, that he never saw. These people
wow,
never saw him. And yet they, gave patronage to him. They gave fealty to him. And he was able to do that through coinage and
oh,
statuary and stuff like that. And if you look at Augustus, most of his portraiture and every single coin you'll find in the Augustan era shows him when he was about in 27 BCE, when he first became the emperor, and he was youthful, he was young, he had this beautiful haircut and everything. You
Mhm.
never see him later like 30 years later when he was old and decrepit and dying. You
Yeah.
never see that. So I just
that's fascinating. We could do a whole podcast on that.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Archaeology for me is that ability to use, use this cultural property, this material goods to assert power and assert dominance. I just find it.
And in many ways, the kind of even the name Augustus, which like it's always associated in when you're talking about Rome with like power and success. Octavian, which before he took the name of Caesar Augustus, Octavian was almost written out of modern history in a way where like you never like people don't really talk about like the sickly boy Octavian. It's always Caesar Augustus and the conquest of the Roman Empire.
Wow.
Yeah, even I mean, it's crazy that you have such a dichotomy, and I'm going to go off on a tangent, so I'm going to stop myself there. But
well, that'll be your fourth appearance on the podcast. We're going to do a deep dive into ancient Rome. So
yeah, I'm just going to have to make just a series for me to come on over and over again. So
dude, let's have that be one of our spin-off series, Nerds and Friends Archaeology Deep Dive with Michael Camarillo. I love it.
I love it.
I love it. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on and talking about Order 516, your new book in your Keeper series. Everyone, again, in the description of the podcast, go to michaelcamarillo.books.com. Get your copy of Order 516 out now. Very exciting. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, as always, my friend. This was great.
Yeah. Hey, I do want to mention real quick before I go that Order 516 is available for 99 cents on Amazon. So keeping it that way all the way through November 1st, possibly later, depending when this episode comes out. I'll probably give it another week on top of this episode. So whenever it comes out, you can bank on another week of 99 cents for this book. Keep 9 I'm giving away for free to anyone who goes to my website and signs up for my newsletter. So michaelcamarillobooks.com, you'll get a free ebook copy of book 1.
Well, I will be doing both those things as soon as this podcast is over, because that's a fantastic deal, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, $1 and you get 2 books, basically.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. This has been an awesome episode of Nerds and Friends. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks for having me.
Of course.
All right. I'm going.
This is the awkward pause where I fade out to black at the end of the podcast.